In May of 2008, 18-year-old Joshua Maddux said goodbye to his sister and went for a walk. This was nothing out of the ordinary for a nature lover and free spirit, but when he didn't return, things took a strange turn. The search for Josh lasted 7 years but yielded no results. Joshua Maddux lived in Woodland Park, a small city of about 7,500 people in Teller County, Colorado, nestled among the natural beauty of the Pike National Forest. Josh was 6 feet tall, 150 pounds, and appeared to have a creative mind and a free spirit. He lived life carefree, grew his hair long, loved music, played the guitar, and spent much of his free time writing. He was a bright student who appeared to be well liked and well known at school. Josh lived with his father Mike and 2 sisters Kate and Ruth after his mother and father divorced. He left the house on May 8, 2008, telling his sister Kate that he was going for a walk. He loved nature and often went out hiking alone, so his sister didn't think much of the farewell, but when he didn't return later that evening, she became concerned. Because Josh had always been such a free spirit, the worry was only a small nagging in the back of their minds at first. However, as the days passed and Josh had still not returned, his father took the sudden disappearance more seriously and called the police on May 13 to report Josh missing. The searches were extensive, scouring the surrounding parkland and neighborhood. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but no clues to his disappearance had been discovered. The hope of finding Josh began to dwindle, and his sister Kate spoke of how she had always hoped that he had simply skipped town to go play music or start a new life, and she had held on to that hope. She wrote about her brother's disappearance in an online post. Josh has always been known for his musical and literary abilities, so perhaps we'll find him on tour with a band or writing successful novels under a pen name so he can maintain his preferred lifestyle of solitude in the woods. They had no reason to believe Josh had gotten into any trouble, and he had not caused them any concern about his mental health, despite the fact that Josh's older brother, Zachary, had committed suicide 2 years prior to his disappearance, on June 1, 2006, a week before his high school graduation. His father spoke about his son's tragic death and how it affected Josh. "I buried his older brother 2 years ago, which was extremely difficult for Josh. His brother's death pushed him over the edge. It was a huge shock for both the family and Josh. He held high regard for his older brother. Despite this difficult time, his family noticed that Josh was doing well and was happy around the time he went missing. The police had no reason to suspect him of any criminal activity, so he was reported missing. The search for the missing person continued, and the file remained open. After they moved, his father Mike retained ownership of the family home in case Josh ever returned, as that would have been the only place he would have known to go, but news of Josh remained elusive. This was true until 2015. Chuck Murphy, 80, a builder from Colorado Springs, was demolishing his old wood cabin on Meadowlark Lane in 2015, which was surrounded by tall pines. Chuck originally bought the cabin in the 1950s. It was formerly the Thunderhead Ranch homestead on Rampart Range Road on Woodland Park's north side. In the 1930s and 1950s, it was an infamous dining, drinking, and gambling complex owned by Big Bert Bergstrom. He moved to America from Sweden in 1912 and opened the Thunderhead Inn as a dining and drinking establishment after Prohibition ended. He also used the ranch for illegal gambling and prostitution, and the FBI apprehended him. The jury found him not guilty in the subsequent trial. The cabin had been abandoned for a decade and had fallen into disrepair. Chuck made the decision to demolish the cabin to make way for property development, and demolition work began in August 2015. Chuck's brother had lived in the cabin until 2005, but since then, it had been used as a storage facility and was rarely visited. When Chuck arrived at the cabin on August 7, there was a noticeable stench from the animals. Chuck made the horrifying discovery of a young man's body, cramped into a fetal position with his legs above his head, as the workers used an excavator to dismantle one of the 2 chimneys in the cabin and reached the interior. He called the police, who arrived with the county coroner, who later positively identified the body as that of the missing man, Joshua Maddux, using dental records. The news of Josh's body's discovery shocked the Maddux family. "The situation makes no sense at all," his sister Kate said. "We expected him to be somewhere else in the world, but he was actually very close. The only thing we can surmise is that he was an 18-year-old kid checking out a cabin, which had been abandoned for a long time, when a terrible accident occurred. The cabin was only 2 blocks away from the Maddux family home, but the search for Josh had passed it by. There had been no sign of life, and there was no reason to inspect the chimney." Chuck Murphy, the cabin owner, had rarely visited, but on the occasions when he had to check in, he had not noticed anything out of the ordinary about the property. Because the cabin was located in the center of a large plot of land surrounded by tall pines about 50 feet from the road, police believed that if Josh had cried for help, no one would have been able to hear him. Al Bourne, the coroner for Teller County, conducted an autopsy and discovered no evidence of drugs in Josh's remains. "The hard tissue showed no signs of trauma," he said. "There were no broken bones or knife marks to be found. There were no bullet holes to be found. A number of questions remain unanswered. It's extremely perplexing. It wasn't death on the spot. It's impossible to say how he died, but we know he didn't starve to death, which takes weeks. So you go down the chain and you have dehydration, which can happen in a matter of days, and hypothermia, which can happen in a matter of days. We don't have any evidence to say which came first." Bourne issued a accidental death ruling on September 28, 2015. Josh, he reasoned, had climbed into the chimney and become stuck in the brickwork. Josh's position in the chimney appeared to have been a voluntary act in order to gain access, according to Bourne. He concluded that hypothermia was the most likely cause of death because the temperature had dropped to the high 20s, -6.7 degrees Celsius, around the time of his disappearance between May 8 and 10, 2008. Prolonged exposure to extremely cold temperatures causes hypothermia. When your body is exposed to cold temperatures, it begins to lose heat faster than it produces. Longer exposures will eventually deplete your body's stored energy, resulting in a lower body temperature. Many residents, including the family, had concerns about the coroner's report. Chuck questioned the coroner's conclusion of accidental death because the chimney had been built 20 years before and was fitted with a thick wire mesh hung from steel hooks to keep animals and debris from becoming lodged inside the chimney or entering the cabin itself. "It was a heavy wire grate, a wire mesh, and I installed it across the chimney about 1 row of bricks from the top," Murphy explained. "We didn't want raccoons or other animals getting into the chimney." Bourne believed the grate was rusted or corroded and added, "Nobody saw the metal mesh, and we didn't see it in any of our photos. It could have vanished." Murphy responded that all metalwork had been collected and taken for scrap during the demolition, which would explain why the mesh was not clearly identified by the coroner because it was nowhere near the chimney. "They were just collecting all the steel, angle iron, and stuff as part of the demolition," Murphy explained. "They had no idea the mesh was important." Bourne reopened the case 3 days after his initial conclusion, admitting to Murphy. Not only did the rebar cast doubt on the original autopsy. A large wooden breakfast bar, for example, that had been ripped from a kitchen wall and dragged over to block the chimney from inside the cabin raised more questions. If the breakfast bar had been ripped from the wall, who did it and why? Josh's body was also discovered in a fetal position, with his legs raised above his head and separated from his torso. He would have had to enter the chimney head first in order to get into such a position. This was an unusual position, and Bourne had previously stated that he believed it would have taken 2 people to position him in this manner. Even stranger, when Josh's body was discovered, he was wearing only a thin thermal shirt, and his clothes were discovered inside the cabin, folded up next to the fireplace. "This one really tested our brains," Bourne said of the evidence. "We discovered his clothes just outside the firebox. He was only wearing a thermal t-shirt. We don't know why he stripped naked, removed his shoes and socks, went outside, climbed the roof, and descended the chimney. It wasn't logical thinking. According to the revised autopsy report, the cause of death was accidental death, murder, or undetermined causes. We've come up with the most plausible explanation, and it will remain an accident, Bourne said. He did, we believe, come down the chimney. There's no way that guy crawled inside that chimney with that steel webbing, Murphy said. He did not descend the chimney, and he was still convinced that Josh's death was not an accident. He was only wearing his thermal shirt, he added. There are no trousers. There are no shoes or socks. Murphy thought it was ridiculous that the teen stripped down to his pants, climbed up the roof, then the chimney, and slid down, knowing he'd be trapped. Theories about Josh Maddux's death and the Andy Newman connection. The police had received a tip that this man had been seen with Josh. They can't give me times and specifics, and we can't generate stuff that goes back 7 years, Al Bourne said of the man. Bourne also doubted that the man could have put Josh in the chimney by himself. Someone had ripped a heavy bar from the kitchen wall and propped it up against the fireplace. Or the fact that Josh's belongings were already inside the cabin, implying that he'd already broken in and would have had to lock himself out to get to the chimney, and he might have noticed that either the flue or the big bar would have prevented him from entering through the fireplace. Or the fact that when he was discovered, Josh's knees were above his head, implying that he would have had to dive in head first. Or maybe it was Josh's bare feet and nakedness from the waist down. Final thoughts on the case. It's a real conundrum, said Chuck Murphy, the cabin's owner. A terrible, tragic story. I only know he didn't go down that chimney. He climbed into the fireplace and went up. But why is this so? I believe it will continue to be a mystery. One of those heartbreaking tales. The situation is strange and perplexing. A number of questions arise. The rebar in the chimney would have prevented anyone from entering unless it had been removed prior to demolition or had rusted away, as suggested by the coroner. Why would Josh take off his clothes and leave them by the fireplace, along with his boots? Why was the breakfast bar dragged to cover the entrance to the cabin's fireplace? What are your thoughts on the Joshua Maddux's case? I really appreciate your input. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Be a part of the Chris Crime Diaries family and hit the subscribe button now.